17 ways I exploited the new Ender Pearl chunk loaders to do some really cool things. Hello there, Ray here. Let's start with the basics and move to more complicated as the video goes on. Leave a like and let's get started. So the way that the Ender Pearl chunk loading works is that we just need to have a Ender Pearl in this chunk here and it'll be loaded. Now typically Ender Pearls will get pulled down by gravity, and when they do touch the ground they will teleport whoever through them. So an easy way to keep the Ender Pearl from hitting the ground is by putting it in a bubble column. So by having a soul sand on the bottom and then a total of 6 water sources above it. This is all being held in, and then if we just stand up here 2 blocks above the bubble column, crouch and move out to the edge here and then throw 1 Ender Pearl. The pearl will not hit the bottom because we have plenty of water, and will be high enough up so that it doesn't come back and hit us. So now the pearl is constantly being pulled down by gravity, but the bubble columns are constantly pushing it upwards. And pearls are entities, so if we press F3 plus B, we can see the hitbox of it. And like all entities, it's affected by the bubble column. So this pearl setting here is now chunk loading. But how big an area is it actually chunk loading? Well, that's where I come in with these handy dandy bees. Fax made these special bees which can put out messages in the chat letting us know what's going on in chunks even if we're not here to see it. And Champion went ahead and updated this data pack so it also works in this newest snapshot. So we have one bee here in the center where the actual bubble column is, and then we have one in a ring just around the center one, and then we have another one in the ring one further out, and then we even have one bee way out here. We can actually see these chunks in game by pressing F3 plus G, so now we can see exactly where one chunk begins and one chunk ends. And the game uses chunks to determine what to load in for the player to see, as the game doesn't want to load everything in, otherwise this would crash your computer. So it'll load chunks around you, and if you leave an area, it will unload the ones you left. So let's see what our bees do when we leave this area. Currently we are standing here, so we are loading all 4 of these bees as entity processing chunks. So with the bees in place, let's see what would happen without the chunk loader. We can remove the pearl just by dropping a trapdoor, and this will collide with it and teleport the player and also remove it. So now let's see what happens when we leave these chunks. You can see in the chat where it said entity processing chunks, it's no longer doing any more updates as the bees have completely unloaded altogether. This is typically what you would expect when the player leaves a chunk. As soon as we come back, they start loading again. Let's put in our Ender Pearl chunk loader, and now let's leave this area. Let's see what happens. So now you can see something different happened. Instead of all the bees being entity processing, now only the very center bee is entity processing. The bee that is one ring out further, which is the red colored chunks, is only being loaded as block processing, meaning the entities typically don't process there, but blocks do. And then the ring of chunks further out are mob cat processing, meaning it can detect mobs in some form. And the bee that was really far out doesn't show up either because it was too far out. And that's exactly what this checker pattern that I made here illustrates. It illustrates that the chunk where the pearl is sitting in is going to be entity processing. So you can run like an iron farm in here, or have mobs grow up in here, or move items around using like water streams. And you can see every single type of farm that can run without a player in these type of loaded chunks in this video here, which you can check out after this one. I'll put it down in the description. Where this chunk out here could only have stuff move through like hoppers or have redstone signals turn on and off. And on this chunk out here, nothing really can occur out here other than that you can use this for a mob switch, which I'll show a little later in the video. And everything out here is completely unloaded, just like the majority of the world around the player. Now in single player, when you leave the game, it will automatically unload everything. And then as soon as you rejoin the game, the Ender Pearl will once again start loading that chunk. It doesn't matter how far away this chunk is from the player, it will automatically start up even after leaving the game. This is extremely useful compared to using like a Nether Portal chunk loader. Once you leave the game, entities that are being sent back and forth through this portal can get unloaded because they need to get processed on either side with the chunks being loaded in the first place. So they can end up stop working when unloaded. But having the Ender Pearl constantly load a chunk could be negative. If you're loading a really laggy farm, you don't want it to be loaded all the time, but you can always hook up some redstone to automatically turn it off. And I'll show you later on how you can actually turn off the chunk loading in this area without actually losing your Ender Pearl, which could be really helpful in automating farms. So I put a pearl in the chamber on a second account. Let's go ahead and log off and see what happens to the pearl as we watch it on the other account. Once we disconnect, the pearl just vanishes. And then when we log back in, the pearl reappears. So on servers, if you place Ender Pearl on a farm that you want to run while you're online, as long as you're online, the chunks will be loaded and your farm will continue to run. But once you log off, the chunks stop loading. You don't have to worry about farms slowing down the server when you're not online. And then once you log back in, it'll automatically start chunk loading it. You can also see when you die, the pearl will be deleted from the game. But if you don't want this to happen, you can change it if you have access to the commands. You can turn this to false. It also works in the end dimension. Let's head over there. So if we choose a random location, build our Ender Pearl chunk loader, put in an Ender Pearl here. I also put in the bees going diagonal. Now I went far away from the Ender Pearl chunk loader, and you can see it is loading the same 1 chunk worth of entity processing and the surrounding 8 chunks with block processing. Now let's head over to the overworld. It's important not to die when you have Ender Pearls inside of the Ender Pearl Stasis chamber, because upon death all pearls are removed. So if we come back over here to the overworld, you can see the same chunks are being chunk loaded in the end dimension without any player even being there. This means it's now possible to load any area in the end dimension, when typically we couldn't do this because we needed nether portal chunk loaders, and nether portals don't work here in the end dimension. Now there's really only one farm that you can benefit from using this, and that is my simple shulker shell farm, as you can build a farm directly at an end city and then just put down one of these chunk loaders. So you don't have to transport the shulker over into overworld to have it being chunk loaded all the time, so the farm continuously makes shulker shells. That's because majority of the end related farms can actually be done here at the entrance end portal, such as my simple sand generator here. Every time it puts items over into the end dimension, it's actually loading this area here. Therefore we don't need an Ender Pearl chunk loader. Now I covered end dimension chunk loading as well as nether portal chunk loading in these 2 videos here, or explain the history of them and even how I originally discovered them over 8 years ago. And there's a lot of cool farms that you can build at this obsidian platform, which I covered in this video here. But the Ender Pearl chunk loader can help support farms, including ones here in the end dimension. Like the sand generator, now we can actually chunk load all the chunks between the obsidian platform and the exit end portal. Notice I have this water stream here. We can push all the items that we collected from our farms up this bubble column here, and then we can push them into this portal here. So we can actually take the items that we farm on the platform and send them to the overworld, where they would spawn at the world spawn point, which is typically in a corner of one of your chunks here inside of your spawn chunks. This means we can finally automate the entire process of my beacon farm without needing to move the player over into end dimension to load those few chunks between the obsidian platform and the exit end portal. And if you want to, you can even chunk load between where you have your shulker shell farm out at an end city all the way to the nearest gateway portal, so that way you can send your shulker shells directly to spawn without having to even come over here to the end dimension to collect them. And to do this, you just need to put one of these bubble columns with ender pearls in every chunk where you have your ice water stream that's transporting items all along your route. Because if you leave a gap between the ender pearl chunk loaders, it'll only be block processing there. I also got the pearl chunk loader to work in the nether dimension. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos. You started up by aligning yourself up against these 2 seed pickles on top of a wall, and then look perfectly straight up, but then angle yourself just so slightly forward, and then throw 1 ender pearl. Sometimes it will fail, and then just try again, and then one of these times the pearl will slightly go forward, and it will land onto the string and the slime. And then once it happens, it is perfect, and it will continue to bounce the pearl up every time it comes down. You don't want to know how many hours I spent trying to get this to work, but the way it works is that the player is lower, so when he throws the pearl up, the pearl goes really high, and the higher it goes, the slower it gets, and by the time it reaches its maximum height, it slows down. And then I calibrated the machine to be able to take any pearl that starts from this height and falls downwards. Because when the player throws the pearl initially, they throw it with a lot of momentum. We need to remove all that player momentum and let it fall down normally. And once it falls with that slower speed, then the tripwire will detect it and then come down and activate the slime at a perfect timing so it continues to bounce it. And then at this point the pearl is stable. It's not going to wobble side to side anymore. It's just going to keep going up and down. No matter how long you have this thing running, it won't fall off of the piston. And if you want to build this up, here is a nice little view of what it looks like with the dimensions, so you can build it just like it is here. Now I'll show you it's working. We'll put in our chunk analyzing bees, 1 in the center and 3 going kitty corner outward. And let's go ahead and just leave this nether dimension. Now we're over here in the overworld, and we can see it is indeed chunk loading it, just like the checker pattern over here on this side. And even if we would log off, meaning that the chunks were completely unloaded, and then we log back in, you can see it automatically starts chunk loading the nether side. So now we can chunk load the nether dimension, although it's not as easy as like the overworld or the end dimension. This might be slightly easier than making 2 nether portals and having entities pass between the 2 of them. But do you think the slime version is easier than the nether portal chunk loader? Now of course you could use this slime version over in the overworld as well as end dimension, but it's definitely harder to set up than using the bubble columns. This does mean you can now make a flying machine that can actually move the ender pearl, and as the machine moves throughout the world, it will continue to load chunks, meaning the flying machine would never unload. I'll probably work on that next, but By the way, if you'd like to see other crazy flying machines, I have an entire playlist covering really useful ones. Now earlier I talked about how we can make peaceful mob switches using these outer chunks on the chunk loader. And making a mob switch is pretty easy. You just need to have 70 mobs here. And once you have them all in the mob cap processing chunks, make sure this chunk's being loaded by your Nether Pearl, then you can leave through the Nether portal. Now when you head back into the overworld in a different location where you're not loading it, and if you pull up your F3 in single player, and you take a look at this M over here, you can see that there is 84 monsters, which are hostile mobs, that are currently being loaded in my world. But if we take a look at our entity count, meaning how many entities are around us, which also includes hostile mobs, you can see we only have around 30, which is telling us that the hostile mobs are way out at our mob switch, and since they're in mob cap processing chunks, they cannot despawn because they're not in entity processing chunks. Therefore, they're preventing other hostile mobs in our world from actually spawning in. If we come look in the caves, you can see that all we have is some bats that are spawning in, but there is no other hostile mobs spawning in whatsoever. This is an easy way to make a peaceful mob switch, so you don't have to worry about running into the majority of the hostile mobs. If this was a bit confusing, I will be doing a tutorial in the future all about mob switches. This trick also works in the end dimension, you just need a whole bunch of endermen in one spot. This trick also works in the nether dimension as well, although in the nether it's a lot easier for other players in multiplayer server to accidentally load your mobs that are sitting in one of these nether chunks because people use this dimension to quickly travel between areas. But if your hostile mobs are despawning, you can always use the 5 different mobs I discovered which can work as mob cap holders while at the same time not despawning. And if you're following my streams, you know I actually found a 6th one. So stop by my stream and say hello, and also get to see how I come up with all these different crazy machines and tricks live. You might be wondering, if an Ender Pearl can load a chunk, what happens when it's between 2 chunks? Does it load 2 chunks as entity processing? So I use this command to teleport my Ender Pearl directly between these 2 chunks. Now if I leave the area, we can see that despite it being perfectly aligned between the 2 chunks, it's only loading one of the 2, and it happens to be loading this south one over here. But we can automatically move the Ender Pearl from one chunk into a different chunk, and this can be done by using redstone. Currently I have the pearl on this side, and if I power this here, it's going to push the pearl over, and then it's going to bob its way over onto this side. So now this chunk is being loaded as entity processing. And then once again, we can turn off this chunk and turn on that chunk for loading by powering this side, and the water is going to flow over and move it to this side. Now the redstone is a little bit weird just because ender pearls can kind of end up moving farther sometimes and closer some other times. So I'm extending the water source after a little bit of delay. That way the pearl doesn't get stuck in this little no man's land in between. You can also use the Pearl chunk loaders in combination with the Nether Pearl chunk loaders. So you can log on to a specific account, which will load this area here. And then once loaded, it will load this Nether Pearl chunk loader, which will automatically start up. And then you can log off the other account and the Pearl chunk loader can unload. But then this one will continue to keep chunk loading this area until the game stops. Help me pay for my electricity by joining as a YouTube member. Not only do you get tons of cool perks, but it also helps me out. And because we can detect the pearl, we can detect when a player logs out. Notice when my alt account logs off, we no longer detect the pearl, and therefore the redstone can depower. Then when alt logs back on again, it reactivates the power. But pay attention to this redstone line here. When the player is logged in, it is completely powered, and when the player logs off, it will also stay completely powered. But I actually made this as a decoder. So if the player logs out and then logs back in with a certain amount of delay, this redstone line will turn off. So let me demonstrate that. Notice how it turned off there for a very brief moment. And it only does that if you log off for about 4 seconds and then log back in again. If you stay logged in, it'll always be powered, and if you stay logged off, it'll always be powered. So I'll show you something really cool that you can do with this. So I went ahead and hooked this up to another Ender Pearl Stasis chamber. This pearl goes to my alt account, and imagine my alt account is millions of blocks away, but they want to get teleported to this location here. So what they would do is they would log off for 4 seconds. And then as soon as they log in, it's going to remove power from this line, which is going to close this trapdoor, which is going to make their pearl break up against it and instantly teleport them millions of blocks without having to have any kind of crazy redstone. It works when this torch turns off here and that torch turns off there, and this repeater also turns off. This only occurs if there is power at the very end there, no power in the middle, and power here in the beginning. And this can only happen if there is a pearl activating it, then there's no pearl, and then there's a pearl. And you can think of these compared to your fade out clocks as really long repeaters. So staying logged off or staying logged in will not activate this. And you can make tons of these different machines. And you can program them so they each work if you log off for a certain amount of seconds. You can teleport yourself anywhere in the world. So you can use this remote switch to automatically turn on and off farms and machines far away without even needing the player here. If you would like to take a look at this machine or any of the other contraptions I showed today, you can find this world download in the description. Now check out this video about all farms I could run with chunk loaders. Thanks to each one of my lovely supporters, and I will see you all next one. Bye bye!